Well, in the months following the release of Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles, now trying to continue in many ways doing precisely what they'd done with Sgt. Pepper. The next album really would have continued on to be something like a kind of Sgt. Pepper Part 2, not unlike Rubber Soul and Revolver can kind of be seen as sort of Part 1 and Part 2 in a certain kind of way, at least according to George Harrison. But unfortunately, as much as the summer of 1967 brought for the Beatles a tremendous amount of success with Sgt. Pepper, it also brought with it a very significant loss, and that is the death of their manager, the manager from the very beginning, 1962, Brian Epstein, who died on August the 27th at the end of the summer at age 32. An accidental overdose, as it turns out. People have tried to suggest that there was something more sinister going on, but it turns out that he probably just lost count of the sleeping pills that he was taking and took too many and never woke up. But with that, the Beatles' business affairs really did begin to fall apart. One of the stories that we'll tell as we go forward into the next couple of weeks of the chorus is how putting back together what Brian had been holding together was not going to be so easy for the Beatles. In the end, they were much better at playing and recording music than they were at doing business, at least at first. As in that way, I mean, who played in a band at that time would have been better at being able to handle the tremendous fortunes the fortune that the Beatles had amassed. So it's hardly to their blame. It's hardly worth blaming them about what happened. But anyway, the important thing is that with Brian Epstein dying, it was very tough for the group, a very, very, very severe blow. At about the same time, and in fact almost exactly the same time, they met the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and in fact went to a retreat in Bangor, I think it was, the very weekend that they heard about Brian's passing. All four Beatles were with the Maharishi. They were very excited about the idea of transcendental meditation because in many ways, when the Beatles were fooling around with drugs and using it recreationally and various kinds of things, they were sort of the idealistic drug users in the sense that they were looking for the drugs to give them some perception of reality that would somehow enhance, that would almost equate with wisdom or knowledge or something like that, some way of getting to the core of what was really going on with reality and existence and all this kind of thing. And so the idea of transcendental meditation also promised that kind of thing, but without the use of drugs. So for the most part, the Beatles turned away from the use of LSD to seek enlightenment in spirituality. Now, some drug use continues. There are the stories about John's addiction to heroin, and certainly Paul and others continuing to use marijuana recreationally. But nevertheless, this sort of exploration of LSD and all that really kind of seemed to be over at this point, and they were really interested in finding out whether they could get even a little bit farther toward the truth with transcendental meditation. So the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi became a very important figure. It is in some ways a blessing for them that when this terrible news of Brian Epstein came to them, they were with the Maharishi, who, whatever you may think of the pluses and minuses of that relationship, really did seem to be a very stabilizing force to get to four guys who still were pretty young, who lost somebody very, very close to them. So from that point of view, it was a pretty fortunate happenstance that they were with him. What begins to happen during this period of fall 1967 is that Paul really is the idea guy. Now, the whole Sgt. Pepper idea, the whole idea of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was kind of Paul's idea. As I said before, John Lennon didn't even think of that album as being a concept album. Paul was the guy who was sort of the concept guy, and so we're going to find a lot of his ideas shaping Beatle projects. So we see Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The next project, the movie A Magical Mystery Tour, was Paul's idea. Some of what happened with the Get Back album and the initial, the one that ended up being released is Let It Be, but the Get Back project we'll talk about. in the last week class. Again, Paul ideas and the whole sort of idea at the end of Abbey Road, the second side. A lot of these things are sort of, Paul was the concept guy sort of driving a lot of these kinds of things. So let's just take a minute to do two things, to look over what we have with regard to singles in the second half of 1967 and talk a little bit about the Magical Mystery Tour movie. In terms of singles, in the summer of '67, as I said before, All You Need Is Love is released for the Beatles as the single that during the summer to go with the album, or roughly with the album Sgt. Pepper. Was recorded in June and released in July, going to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. It was written especially for the Our World satellite TV broadcast. At least that's what one of the stories is. I think Paul in the anthology said, no, I think it's a song John just had laying around. And then Ringo says, no, he actually wrote it essentially for this. So who knows? Both guys were there, and their account of it differs. But nevertheless, it was recorded for this. It was recorded especially for the Our World satellite TV broadcast. One of the first satellite TV broadcasts to hook up the whole world together. It's hard to think of in these days that in 1967 it was a big deal to be able to see something live from another country or on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But that's essentially the way it was. And the Beatles were representing England in that enterprise. So they did it. They didn't exactly do it live. The backing tracks had been done. They sort of mimed the backing tracks but sang live. Anyways, if you look at the tune, it uses the French national anthem at the beginning and the end. It uses sort of a collage tune. We'll return to it when we talk about this as one of our song close-ups a little bit later, a later video here. The B-side of it, Baby You're a Rich Man, in many ways relates to a song like Getting Better or We Can Work It Out, but very much a kind of a B track for the Beatles. So that's what we've got happening in July of '67. Now, Hello Goodbye is released in November of 1967, after all of the Sgt. Pepper hubbub, again going to #1 on both sides of the UK. A great tune with a kind of an extended ending. So when they get to the end of the tune, they go into that long sort of hey-la, hey-la, hey-loa thing that they do at the end. And that extended ending is maybe prefigures what we're going to see happening in Hey Jude when that song comes out with the sort of big extended ending. Of course, Hey Jude is the much bigger version of what's happening with Hello Goodbye. Again, a Paul song. The B-side is I Am the Walrus. A John song was recorded in September of 1967. The nonsense lyrics sort of posed as literature. John apparently had heard a story about somebody who was teaching English or something back in Liverpool, using his songs and trying to sort of find meanings in his songs. So he created lyrics that were full of kind of fake meaning, in some ways even including a line from a children's song. It's sort of a goofy children's song they used to sing when they were kids. But the avant-garde tendencies of I Am the Walrus clearly hook up with songs like Strawberry Fields, Mr. Kite, things like that. Before we move on to talking about the Magical Mystery Tour album or whatever it was, and you'll see what I mean when we get to the next video, let's take just a minute to talk about the movie. It was shot in September of 1967 and produced and directed by the band. That was maybe the first mistake, that they decided that since they were the Beatles, they probably could do their own movie. I mean, how hard can it be, right? I mean, they'd done A Hard Day's Night, they'd done Help. Well, it turns out you can't just run a bus and a bunch of people, you know, from a casting catalog and just do a kind of a movie. But that's what they thought they could do. It was influenced by Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters and their bus, the Further Bus. Ken Kesey would take this group of merry pranksters around, and they would go from town to town dispensing LSD to people to create these LSD-infused evenings, and they'd heard all about that because this, of course, was just after the Summer of Love, so they were hearing all about what was going on in San Francisco. The movie was debuted on the BBC December the 26th, 1967, and after having been shot to take full advantage of the sort of kaleidoscopic colors, it was broadcast in black and white. Well, it was panned by the critics. They hated it. In fact, the reviews were so bad that the U.S. broadcast rights were canceled. The American network said, you know, we're going to pull out of this deal, and it never got broadcast when it was supposed to in this country. Roundly thought of as having been an ambitious kind of overreaching of the Beatles, moving outside of what they did best, thinking they could do films. John Lennon called it the most expensive home movie ever. However, Paul McCartney defends it on the idea that where else can you see a video performance of I Am the Walrus? That's what he said. Anyway, if you're a Beatles fan, you might want to check out Magical Mystery Tour at least once and see if you think that these critics are correct or incorrect in their estimation and their evaluation of the film. Let's now turn our attention in the next video to Magical Mystery Tour, the album.